Hello and welcome to another Aston Originals podcast from Aston History. I'm Brian Sudlow. As I often say in these podcasts, everyone and everything has a past. And that's especially true of today's topic of food. We make our food and our food makes us. And because it makes us, it shapes our history. From the Last Supper to the very first Thanksgiving of the Pilgrim Fathers, from the hunger that killed a million Ukrainians under Stalin in the 1930s to today's obesity crisis and overconsumption. In symbol and in reality, in feast and in famine, food, glorious food, makes and breaks us on a daily basis and indeed throughout history. Well, I'm delighted today to welcome onto the podcast Sophie Beckett, a public health officer from Birmingham Council, who's been running a project on the oral history of food in Birmingham, and on how those histories can help us think about food and health today. Sophie, you're very welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm also joined, as so often, by Dr Ilaria Scalia, Senior Lecturer in History at Aston University and a cultural historian.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Nice to see you, Ilaria. And we're also joined by our colleague, Dr Duane Mellor from Aston Medical School, Senior Lecturer and a dietitian.
Great to be here.
Duane, thanks very much for coming along. So, Sophie, let me come to you first. We met at the think tank about a month ago when you had an event that was explaining about some of these historical sources that the Birmingham Museum Trust have on food heritage. Tell us a little bit about your project and about what you're hoping to achieve.
Thanks, Brian. So we have a selection of oral history interviews at the museum. We have about actually 5,000 records, but I'm looking just at 90 records, which were recorded in 1984 and chart food and drink history over that kind of period between about the 1900s to 1984 when they were recorded. So I'm using these oral histories as to sort of reposition them as community health assets that can be used beyond sort of traditional museum setting. So what that will involve will be the kind of transcribing, uploading, cataloguing, the sort of museum side of the oral histories and making them accessible to the general public. I'll also be recording new oral histories. So in order to use them as a comparative data set, so looking at the old records and then seeing how that's changed within the landscape today and seeing what sort of messages and learnings we have from that. I'm also coding the oral histories with the food strategy by public health at Birmingham City Council. So that involves looking at where there are overlaps in the history and where there are sort of lessons that can be learned from that. I'm also going to be using nostalgia as a public health tool. So thinking about how we can use them to engage the public, to think about healthy eating and the sort of food choices and practices today. So food is obviously deeply sort of embodied and complex, and it really cuts across a multiple of different disciplines. So thinking about sociology, geography, biology, culture, politics, and health in the same way is, whilst also being deeply personal, is very much a social and place-based phenomena. So I think oral history, marrying the two together, is a really useful methodology to look at the kind of challenges historically and the issues that we face in present day.
So from the point of view of the public, it strikes me that one of the fascinating things here is that the people who recorded these oral histories back in the 80s, their children, their grandchildren could well be in the city, and people might actually hear the voices of their own family members.
Yeah, so I've been doing some research into looking if trying to reach out to some of the individuals. But I think that's what's great about this collection is that it is so sort of personal, and UK-based oral histories has always been grounded in the everyday and people and recording the kind of everyday people that aren't necessarily always highlighted within history. So I think it'd be really great for those to be able to get out there and for the general public to listen.
Okay. Sophie, thanks very much indeed. Duane, let me come to you as a dietitian, as a food scientist. How do you see such a project?
It's covering a long period of time. It's covering nearly 100 years of how cities developed. And if you go back to the beginning, food was very much labor intensive in the home. During that period, we had the custard factory was actually making custard powder. So we have this idea of processed foods coming in. in the middle of it, we have the war with rationing, and that's from a nutrition point of view with the Ministry of Food. There's oral histories there with some of the scientists going on in London, and they looked at quantifying what humans need to be healthy. Then after the war, we had change in agricultural policy, which meant we had more supply and met the calorie need, but also dual income households. So the amount of time to put into the labor of food making at home decreased. So convenience came in. So, we're not blaming the custard factory for processed food, but it was part of a chain that moved forward, and we've had increasing sort of processed foods. And also, if you look at that, if you put in the middle of that things like Windrush, as well as the Irish migration to the city, as well as the South Asian migration to the city, the food culture's changed. And has it retained some of that identity from individuals? I always talk about the simplicity of food and its basics, back in history, in both in the UK, but also in places like India, and also in sort of European countries, eating the fresh vegetables and fruit and things that are available is associated with health. But as we move into urbanized cities, we tend to bring more processed foods in, which can then merge, the high fat, high sugar, high salt dishes from one cuisine with another. And we get this mixed homogenization. And do we lose identity? And is that a problem? And do we need a food identity? Have the British ever had a food identity? And have we lost it? And where are we now?
These are all crucial questions, and in a minute we're going to come to Ilaria for some of the historical responses to those sorts of questions. Let me ask you as well, though, from a dietitian's point of view. Normally we think about diet as being this quite scientific practice. We need to be counting calories. We need to be thinking about macros, not eating too much of this or too little of that. How do you think this approach, this more cultural approach to food, can help us with that scientific dimension of trying to enhance health?
I think it's important because if we look at the UNESCO definition of a Mediterranean diet, it's the intangibles it mentions, it's the social aspects. If we look at how they've tried to transform health policy in Brazil, it's about acquiring food with others, it's about preparing food with others, it's about sharing food with others. You mentioned at the start about these great things, like the Last Supper is iconic in Western culture as a shared meal. If you actually go to parts of Southeast Asia, you cannot do business with people without eating with them. How we share food and that aspect is possibly not as important, but it has different importance to the biological function of food. And it was great when we're talking about the idea of these are health things that we talked about, is that if people have an identity through food, they may have a reason to explore their culture, their past, and that gives them a grounding both psychologically and may explore some of the traditional foods which may be healthier. So you can get the two things to work together. We've got a time of year at the moment where we've got sort of Christians in Lent. So we've got something like the Greek Orthodox who are fasting in one way, and then you've got sort of our Muslim friends who are in Ramadan. And the cultural aspects around food can be both healthy or unhealthy depending on how that is put together. So we can look at these various dimensions of faith, of identity, and put them with sensible health messages, so we don't have to count every calorie, but we can actually make it more holistic so people can enjoy food that they identify with, which is also healthy.
So in other words, we shouldn't be severing biology from conviviality.
Exactly. And some people would argue that since we lost all our fur and the fleas in that fur, the way we bond as society is by feeding and sharing food, because we can no longer pick the nits out of each other's hair.
Well, yes, I can see that's a real problem. Let me hand over, if I may, not to talk about nits, hopefully, but to talk
Thank you.
more about kind of the history, this historical perspective on Sophie's project, and indeed on some of the issues that Duane's just brought forward. Ilaria, how do you see this project?
Well, it's very timely we're having this conversation. I've just returned from a conference in Finland, in Tampere, from the Center for the History of Experience. And one of the themes that emerged there is that human beings not only associate food with their identity, but they seem to have a need historically and even in the present to do so. Displaced communities who do not know their history, people who have been removed from their families through different political upheaval and so on, try desperately to reconstruct their histories. And one of the first ways in which they do it is to try to figure out what their people used to eat and how they used to eat it. And they truly treasure those objects, anything from cookery to particular implements or spaces. So this is not just a decorative part of the human experience, it's a human need to go back to how each group and each family, clan, however they describe or see themselves, have eaten over time, and then to see themselves as part of the longer history. So that's very important. And then, of course, history of health is a big part of history itself. You know, we study not only what people used to do politically or wars against one another, but how people have handled the societies, their own health concerns. And often we discover that there is no part of society that wasn't touched. War economies and wars were often about feeding the soldiers, feeding the populations, or starving them. And so there is no aspect of either food or history that can be disentangled from these other themes that we consider so important.
And I mean, surely it's also the case as well in a city like Birmingham that in the same way that we have, as it were, a crossroads of many foods here, we also have a crossroad of many histories, of the histories of many peoples who have brought their food here as well.
Absolutely. The city of Birmingham cannot be disentangled from global trends and, the history of colonialism, the empire, and all of these things because of then the historical forces that then led so many people to come here. But also the history here is connected to them in the places they came from. Often, we study in our program a lot of colonial history and global history, and many of the themes we explore with our students, right, are about what is it the Brits were trading? What is it they were cultivating? And often were things connected to food. There were tea that they were drinking, there were spices they were trading, there were different kind of elements that then again became part of the larger food chain. And so it is the history of the people of Birmingham, regardless if they're people that have come recently or not. They're really part of the city in every corner, in every aspect.
Yeah, and I guess it's also true as well, isn't it, that a lot of the phenomenon of globalization, which we tend to think of now as the fruit of communication technologies and modern transport, really begins as a trade in very basic goods. The import of tobacco, the import of foodstuffs from the New World back to Europe, and so on. Quite apart from the other histories with the other objects of transatlantic trade, such as the slave trade and so on. But food is a really big element in those early days of globalization.
It is, and that's why Sophie's project is so important. And that's why it's so important to have always a historical dimension to how we see health. Because it would be tempting to just think, of course, we're getting better and better, and why do we need to bother with how people used to do things or what they used to think in 1984? But unless we turn back and look at the past and understand the longer histories of how people have dealt with those global issues, how they saw themselves, how they understood their own nostalgia, their own importance, their own habits, how did they conceptualize their own eating choices? Is it to be healthy? Is it to feel like they belong? Is it to show their love towards families or communities? Unless we understand that bit, then we'll never understand how they look at food today, where they're coming from in the moment in which we're talking about health. Either because a pandemic is hitting us and all of a sudden we can't smell the food, or because we find ourselves all of a sudden becoming more aware of the limits of our own food supplies and going to the shop, we find those shelves empty, or because being distant from people and not being able to eat with them like we're used to might matter to one community more than another. None of this we will be able to do without projects like these and people using them and studying them and truly engaging with them in meaningful ways, and then feeding that information into the healthcare system, into our discussions from politics to society and everything else.
Can I just, before we sort of come back to Sophie and open up for wider discussion, can I come back to a very particular point here? We often talk about this, the problem that history is seen by some people as it's a hobby. It's a nice hobby. But is it not true that a project like this is showing precisely the kind of leverage that heritage has, and indeed must have, since even these apparently scientific practices like nutrition are deeply entwined with our cultural practices? Just to come back to the point I made to Duane before about biology and conviviality, one could say that a society in which conviviality has been on the decline, we can think of our individualism, our ability, for example, these days to work from home, to exercise from home, to shop from home, and so on. Our more shattered, atomized society might actually just be bad for our health, quite apart from the fact that we're not eating with other people and everything that does for us. So it's, the leverage of history, this is surely an issue here too.
It is an issue, and I think it's important also to expand the definition of history. Sometimes people think of history as studying, kings and queens and wars and those kind of things. They don't necessarily think about studying practices like people working from home or not, eating at home or not, cooking their own food or not. And that's an important part. Or they don't necessarily think about studying the mentality of the people, preparing, cooking, of course, the entire food chain. It's not lost on me. We're having this discussion at Aston. That's not, I think, just a coincidence. I'm fortunate to look at the Aston University Archives records. We have these programs from the beginning of the 20th century, wherein, I'm on this very places, the Birmingham Technical College first, and then later on when we moved on this campus, people were talking about cookery. They were teaching cookery and telling anybody from schools to hospitals to, government guidelines, or what should we be telling people to cook? What should go in the history, in the cookbooks that we sell? What should we encourage people to eat? But also in cultural productions, what should food look like? What does good food look like? What does British food look like? And, all of those things are part of history. All of those things universities help to make, particularly in places like ours. And all of those things we should treasure and truly embed in what we consider understanding something. And so that's why, again, we're so fortunate to have these records, so fortunate to have these interviews. And it's so important that we continue to use them, and we don't just let them rot in a box, but actually truly listen to them, and then try to make sense of our own present in light of what we learn.
Sophie, let me come back to you, and we'll open then for wider conversation. Two things really. One is ultimately through your project, how do you see these records being made available to the public, so that they can access them and benefit from them and so on? And also, what do you really aspire to achieve through this project?
So I think just drawing on a couple of things that have been mentioned as well, I think history and oral history specifically add to the kind of methodological understandings of research. So oral histories provide a real lived experience and a lived narrative, which can kind of provide more insight into social and health phenomena than maybe traditional health inquiry. And also in terms of the context and the content of the sort of narratives discussed, our ancestors learned how to live off the land and live frugally. And this resourceful practice is something that's still really relevant and necessary for today. And I think we've got a lot to learn from our kind of historical narratives. In terms of the aspirations for the project, I'm keen for the availability and the accessibility of the records to be forefronted within that. So having people be able to just access them online and digitalize the collection as part of this. But then also for people to be able to engage in the ways that they see that they want. So I'm trying to offer a range of activities alongside that in order to make them accessible, because really it's about the history of the city. So it needs to be available for the people of the city currently.
Okay. Fantastic. Let me sort of open up a little more widely here. But Duane, I'd particularly like to come back to you as well. You know, we're talking about our food pasts. How does that link us to our food futures, do you think?
I was just thinking about that, and I was thinking about potatoes and tomatoes and even chilies. They are relatively new. If you look at histories from King and Queen, we didn't have them, before the Renaissance. Potatoes were mistrusted and had to be sold to the European public. Cocoa, chocolate. People thought the beans were mouldy, gone off things when they first came. So if we go to our past, our current wasn't even visible. And we're in a stage now where we like the exotic. And is that good or bad? We like the quinoa, but we don't need barley. Is that good? Because nutritionally, they're not that different, but one's exotic, one's not. So we like the exotic. But also, our current food system has been narrow and funneling down to fewer and fewer crops. Is that an effect of urbanization? Possibly. The need to have a food system, the logistics to get that food into a city. So it means it gets simplified, but we have more choice in our shops, but less difference. So I'm hopeful of sustainability coming in, meaning that we need to look for more diversity, and that's going to be an effect of climate change. But we need to look back at some of the forgotten foods in our history, some of the crops we may use less, and we can use them in restorative farming. We can use different practices to actually give that variety. But the problem is, if we're time pressed, how do we get people the confidence to try foods from the past as well as new foods? And we're in a system where a market pushes out a lot of food with a lot of glossy marketing, and that can distort our eating behaviours. So I think this project, Sophie's project, is brilliant because we can look at what people enjoyed in the past. I'm not saying instant mashed potato was brilliant, but there was good foods in the past that we've possibly lost sight of. And by reintroducing those and getting people to talk and re-identify with those could give us a positive future where the British people of Birmingham can reinvent and redirect their attachment to food in a healthy way.
I think one of the things that you're saying there as well is that it's not just about the individual choices that we want to make, which is that's what advertising wants to persuade us is the only reality. We see the advert, we decide we want it, and off we go. But it's also about, as it were, the everything that surrounds that. It's the network of shops that are available, of products in the shops, and also I guess things like affordability and also acceptability. It's remarkable to see how certain animal products are sold in the supermarket, but not others. You've got to really work hard to get, shin of beef and things like this, because it doesn't package up quite as nicely as other sorts of meat. But that means that our food choices, which, as I say, we think of in a very individualistic way, are also heavily shaped by the options that we have before us.
I think it's interesting. You can go into supermarkets and it's hard to buy ingredients now. It's already put together in composite foods or ready-made food. And I was thinking about sort of you could say, well, we've got more food outlets on our streets, but is there more variety of food outlet? Or are they selling there's chicken, there's pizza, there's sort of the takeaway type thing? Are there variety there? Is there less variety now than you would have seen in street food going past? We have some great examples in Birmingham. So Digworth Dining Club's another way you get that variety, and those food entrepreneurs and those food sort of shakers and movers are trying to make things different. But on the high streets, and the high street in Birmingham is no different to the high street in Manchester and the high street in London's. They're very similar. And is that something that we want, or is it something that's healthy for us both as humans, as a society, but also biologically?
I also, I think what you were raising there is really interesting, thinking about urban planning. And I think it's really easy to be, it's a lot easier to be an ethical consumer in parts of South Birmingham, for example. Whereas in areas in sort of some parts of North and East Birmingham, thinking about maybe Hodge Hill, which is a food desert, it's actually, you have to work a lot harder in order to kind of access some of these foods that you could considered to be healthy, right? And I think the choice between, when we think about choice within food, the choice between a piece of fried chicken and a salad is sort of linked to social positions and tied up in race and class and gender. And I think it's really difficult to, you're talking about responsibilization and thinking about who's responsible for those food choices. And I think that is sort of built into our environment as well.
I was going to say, it's historic as well. It goes back to, at least the Normans, where we look at mutton is a meat. That's a French word. Sheep is more of a Saxon word. It's a whole thing that's been ingrained in our society through history. And you're right, it's not just the availability. It's if you're on a lower income, the amount of sort of work you're doing to keep surviving means you haven't got the space to think of that next recipe you want to make. So you're hit from all angles in parts of the city. But this is historically embedded in our culture. Just even going back to the names of food, and do we really have freedom, or are we controlled by sort of powers that influence both marketing but also language and history?
I'd suggest it might be somewhere between the two. There's a bit of both. Could I just ask? I want to bring Ilaria back in, but can I just ask for people who are watching, what do you mean by a food desert in a modern British city?
Sure. So food deserts are typically defined as areas where they're linked with transport and availability of supermarkets. So thinking about how the relative distances to major supermarket outlets, which have accessible, affordable, fresh food and produce, and then, where they're built within the placed environment. So how far it would take you to drive or to get a bus, what the public transport looks like. Often cities are often based around you sort of moving inwards like this. They struggle more so with transport that goes around in a circle. The respective distance to a supermarket and the availability within that. And that defines the food desert. We're moving away from the term food desert, but because it implies a sort of natural phenomenon where it's actually a built environment issue. But
it's the result of choices that we've made
Exactly.
without thinking about other things. Okay, this seems to me to link food history also to the history of the city and the history of how the city shapes us as well.
It's connected to the history of the city and to the history of states. Food has also been throughout, really, at least for the last 2 centuries, but I would argue probably even further back, a major political issue. One of the first things that newly established nation state did was to claim a food tradition. At one point I wrote a book about the Alps and different countries that became independent all across the Alpine range. One of the first things they did was to copyright particular food, put in a patent and say, this is the French fondue versus the Italian fondue versus... They've been melting cheese for centuries, but all of a sudden, right, there has to be a national recipe. There has to be a marker that says, this is my cheese, this is my thing. And this is just one example. But throughout, anything from the history of nationalism through the history of international organizations, think about the discussions about the patenting of foods within the European Union or within pretty much an international organization was defined politically. And then when you come to domestic policy, right, think about the old Brexit debate without getting into the different sides, but there was an awful lot of talk about fisheries, and there was an awful lot of talk about, where food comes from, where it should come from, and different rules. And so when you were talking about how people accept food, how they think they should be eating ethically, but also politically to help a particular cause or another, there is a historical dimension to this. And when you think about cities and what led to cities being divided a certain way, having transport structured a certain way, having particular communities then being pushed in one part of the city or another, and therefore the food desert or the food plenty being one place or another. These are also political debates, and they're not always easy. They're not always cordial when we start to engage with them historically, but there is no escaping them. They are an essential part of where we've been. There is an essential part, let's face it, of where we are and where we will be.
Yeah.
And then one final point I wanted to bring up is the question of ethics. We're fortunate to be surrounded by students, often very young. And despite the fact we're getting older, we keep getting exposed to new generations daily. And we talk to them, with them, about all those topics we try to avoid at the dinner table, no pun intended. And one of them is the ethics of one should be eating. And our young, often feel very strongly about that. Some people think, for instance, that the conscious ethical thing to do is to be vegan, for instance, to save the environment. Others instead feel really should be about carbon footprint and eating local. Others still, instead, they understand the importance of food as being connected to their community, to eat something traditional that links them religiously or culturally to a particular group. This too has a history. This too is political. And so whenever we talk about acceptance and what people think they should be eating, this is evolving over time. When I was at university, I don't recall having as heated arguments about what I should be eating. I would probably be more likely to think about what I would like to eat. And that's a major shift that I've seen just within my own lifetime. Those interviews that you're analyzing are going to provide a much longer arc and a much a deeper, I guess, and longer perspective on where we have been that can be helpful for other places besides Birmingham. It's really about understanding new generations and understanding where we've been throughout this process.
Ilaria has just raised questions that I think could be the stuff of another podcast. The overlap of food with food history, with ethics, but also then how the food ethics might overlap with food politics as well. Because it also seems to me that some of the choices that are put to people as ethical dilemmas, in fact, are wholly mixed up also with political dimensions.
Absolutely.
As well. Duane, can I come to you just for some final words about Sophie's project, or indeed about this whole topic?
And I think there's an interesting thing looking at Birmingham. Birmingham still has a thriving, although it struggles at time to time with the pandemic, food market. And we've talked about supermarkets and where we buy, but the shift that you hopefully see and you will see is a shift from going to a market to buy food to a supermarket. And I think it goes with what Ilaria was saying about the ethics of food. When it's bought from a market that's attached to the wholesale, which is attached to the farmer, you're reducing potentially that chain of supply. It may not always the travel. You might be getting your carrots from Lincolnshire. You might be getting your potatoes from Evesham. That sort of thing. But we know where it comes from. So that provenance, that identity, possibly was there more where we had markets in the 50s and before. And the shift to supermarkets, have we lost that link to where the food comes from? And that's something that would be really interesting to see. And, the idea of food deserts, the way the city's been built up, it used to be built around markets. Towns formed around markets. And that's something that'll be interesting to see what comes out and whether people are attached to the food through that route.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about growing food. The allotment.
The
whole idea of growing one's own food. That's another big part, even before the market.
Yeah. Sophie, over to you for a final word. How do you see this project unfolding just in the next few months?
Yeah, it's just been absolutely great to be here and talk about food and history. I think with the increasing sort of pressure on local councils and thinking about place-based approaches, I think that involving communities is going to be paramount to the future of the project. So ensuring that I'm getting a community voice, not just within it, but so that sort of grounds the entire project. And I think it's also important not to homogenize the communities within that, and that's where the oral history comes in. So thinking about individual sponsors and to not sort of generalize within entire communities about their need to sort of continue the work of the food team at the council, where they're doing lots of community-based work already, and to get that sort of insight into individual lives and narratives around food.
Thank you very much. Ilaria, final word?
We're always keen, right, with our students to engage with this kind of communities project. This is really something we're trying very aggressively to do, to send them out to work with these kind of things. Hopefully we'll get them to be able to listen to some of those interviews and to help with that process, really to turn history training into doing more of this kind of work. Yeah. And rather than learning from the textbook, really to go back to those voices we are lucky to have.
Yeah. Because after all, it's very important as well for us as a university to reach out beyond the walls of the university, to be engaged there in the community and speaking to the council and so on. And the very fact that you're actually leveraging these histories for the sake of the wider community, that's really fantastic. Well, all the best with that project.
Thank you.
That's quite enough from us, I think, on this Aston Originals podcast from Aston History. It just remains for me to say thank you very much to our guest, Sophie Beckett, and also to my colleagues, Ilaria Scalia and Duane Mellor. Food, glorious food. Do keep your eyes peeled for all the activities associated with Sophie's project, and we'll see you again on another edition of the Aston Original podcast with Aston History. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.